4 million people watched him say it. He was standing outside a restaurant in the South End, in the coat she used to tease him about, and he looked directly at the camera and said the words with the calm of a man who had rehearsed them in a cab. She was 23 weeks pregnant. She watched the video alone, in a kitchen in Jamaica Plain, with her hand on her stomach and her coffee going cold. This is what happened after. The radiator in Julia Sullivan's apartment had been knocking since October, and the landlord had stopped returning her calls sometime in September. She'd learned to live with it, the irregular clunk, clunk, clunk that started up around 6 in the morning, like a drunk trying to get comfortable in a chair that didn't fit. She'd learned to live with a lot of things. It was a Monday, the kind of Monday that comes with grey skies, and the specific smell of Boston in autumn. Wet leaves, exhaust, and something underneath it all that wasn't quite cold yet, but was getting there. She'd woken at 5:40 because Ben had been restless, pressing his elbows into her ribs in ways that made sleep impossible. 23 weeks. Her midwife at Brigham and Women's had said second trimester insomnia was normal. Her midwife had not said what to do at 5:40 on a Monday when you couldn't sleep and you were alone and the radiator wouldn't stop. She'd made coffee. She was standing at the kitchen window, watching the figuera, the little fig tree she kept meaning to sketch but never did, when her phone started buzzing on the counter. She didn't look at it right away. She had a rule about phones before 7. It buzzed again, then again. Then it just kept going, one after another, the vibrations walking the phone slowly across the laminate countertop toward the edge. She picked it up. 19 notifications. The first was from her neighbor in 4B, Kira Osei, who normally only texted about parking or packages. Ju, you need to see this. The second was from her paralegal Dawn. Then her college roommate Stephanie, who lived in Philly now, and who Julia hadn't spoken to in 3 months. Then more, and more. The preview on one of them showed a link and 4 words that Julia read, and then read again. Danny Maccabee just went live. She put the mug down on the counter, missed the edge slightly, so it tilted but didn't fall, and opened the link. The video had been recorded the night before, outside Toro on Washington Street in the South End. She recognized the restaurant. They'd been there once on a Tuesday in May, splitting the corn with creamer and talking until the server started flipping chairs around them. She recognized the coat he was wearing, dark charcoal, the one with the slightly too wide lapels that he'd bought in London and that she used to tease him about. She recognized the set of his jaw, 3 reporters, someone's camera phone catching the whole thing from an angle. "I don't have a child," Danny said. His voice was steady, controlled in the way that was specific to him. Not calm, just contained, like everything was behind glass. "I've never been in a serious relationship with this woman. Whoever is spreading this story is trying to take advantage of my name. And if there is a child—" He stopped, looked directly at the camera closest to him. "It's not mine." Julia watched it once. Then she watched it again. Then she set the phone face down on the counter and stood there for a while with her hand flat on the laminate and her eyes on the figuera. The sky outside was fully grey now. A pigeon landed on the fire escape, looked at her for a moment, and left. She wasn't crying. That surprised her a little. She'd cried in this kitchen before, over her mother, over a case she'd lost, over a phone call from Jim that had started normal and ended with her realizing he'd started drinking again. She knew how crying in this kitchen felt. This wasn't that. This was more like the moment before a car accident, that half second where you see what's coming and your brain processes it perfectly, every detail clear, every implication understood, and your body just hasn't caught up yet. She put her hand on her stomach. 23 weeks. She'd started doing that recently without realizing it. This automatic gesture, palm flat against the curve of her belly, like she was steadying something. Like she was telling Ben, "I see it, I know, I've got you." The office of Sullivan and Park, which wasn't technically in Park anymore because Denise had gone out on her own 2 years ago, and Julia had kept the name partly out of loyalty and partly because she'd already had the cards printed, occupied the 3rd floor of a building on Washington Street in Jamaica Plain, just above a dry cleaner that was only open 4 days a week, and a bakery that made the whole stairwell smell like cardamom on Tuesday mornings. Julia got there at 8:15, which was early even for her. Dawn looked up from the front desk, registered her face and said nothing, which was one of the things Julia liked most about Dawn. She closed her office door, sat down. The chair had a small tear in the armrest that she'd been meaning to have reupholstered for 2 years, and she spent a moment picking at the edge of it without meaning to. Her phone hadn't stopped. By 8 in the morning, the video had 2.6 million views. By 10, it was over 4 million. Her name had surfaced in the comments. Someone had found a photo of them together at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum Gala from February, back when she was still narrow enough that you couldn't tell. And now, her name was attached to the story in ways her name had never been attached to anything in her life. An email from a reporter at the Herald came in at 9:42. She deleted it. A text from Jim, her father, at 10:15. Jewel, call me when you can. He always called her Jewel. Had since she was 6. When Patricia Sullivan had suggested the nickname during some long-forgotten road trip, and it had stuck the way some things only stick in families. She stared at the text for a long time. Typed, "I will, Dad." Sent it. Didn't call. At 11, a process server knocked on the office door. The letter was from Prescott, Aldridge and Moore, one of the 3 most expensive family law firms in Massachusetts. It was brief, which made it worse somehow. In formal language that Julia could pass cold even on a bad day, it suggested that she refrain from making public statements that could be construed as defamatory to the Maccabee family name. She read it twice. Then she folded it neatly along its existing crease and put it in the top drawer. Dawn knocked a few minutes later and leaned against the doorframe. She didn't say anything at first, just stood there holding 2 mugs of coffee that Julia hadn't asked for and hadn't known she needed. "Prescott," Julia said. "I know," Dawn said. "He lawyered up before he called me." Dawn set one of the mugs on the desk. "What do you need?" Julia looked at the drawer where the letter was. "I need Denise's number for the family law guy she mentioned last spring, the one in Cambridge." "Marcus Webb?" "That one." Dawn nodded and was gone. Julia sat alone for a moment. Somewhere outside, a truck was backing up, the alarm doing its repetitive beeping that nobody in a city ever actually pays attention to. Her coffee was already going cold. She picked it up and drank it anyway. Too bitter, the filter had probably been in there since Friday, and looked out the window at the grey sky and the back end of the building across the alley, with its rusted fire escape and the one window where someone had taped a string of lights that were still on. She hadn't spoken Danny's name out loud since the video. She was going to wait as long as possible to do that again. In a different part of the city, the kind of different that in Boston means 15 minutes and an entire economic universe away, Daniel Maccabee stood in the hallway outside Operating Room 4 at Massachusetts General Hospital and stripped his surgical gloves off one finger at a time. The procedure had gone well. Orbital reconstruction on a 34-year-old who'd been in a car accident in Waltham 6 weeks ago. Technically demanding, 6 hours, the kind of surgery that asked everything of you and gave back the quiet satisfaction of having done something genuinely difficult correctly. His resident, a 3rd-year named Tomas, had been solid throughout. He balled the gloves and dropped them in the bin and stood at the scrub sink running water over his hands. The fluorescent light above him had been flickering for 2 weeks. Facilities had been notified. Nobody had come. His phone was in his locker. He knew what was on it. He'd known since last night, standing outside Toro in the cold with 3 cameras and his own voice saying things he'd decided in the cab on the way there. Decided in the particular way of a man who makes decisions from behind a wall, cleanly, efficiently, without examining them too closely. He'd turned the cameras off in his head the moment he started talking. That was a skill he'd developed, somewhere between his 2nd year of residency and the acquisition of a name worth protecting. You just didn't look at it. You got through the thing. You dealt with consequences later. Later was here now. His attending, Dr. Reeves, passed him in the corridor and said something about the orbital case that Danny answered without really hearing. 2 nurses walking the other way. The familiar geography of the hospital, which had become, over 9 years, more reliable than any other space in his life. The floors that were always too bright. The particular acoustics of the hallway by the elevators. The smell of the place. Antiseptic and something underneath it. Something vaguely like institution, like decades of human emergency absorbed into the walls. He got his phone from his locker and sat down on the bench. 42 missed calls. Texts from Palmer that started calm at 9 and escalated to all caps by noon. His PR firm, his father's assistant. 2 numbers he didn't recognize that had probably already left voicemails he wasn't going to listen to. 1 text from his mother. Just 4 words. "Call me. Today. Please." Catherine Maccabee did not say please. Not to anyone. The words sat there like a stone in the middle of the screen. He locked the phone and put it in his bag. In the locker room, changing out of his scrubs, he caught his own reflection in the metal door of the locker. which gave back a warped silver version of himself, the way funhouse mirrors do, slightly too long and too narrow. He stood there for a second looking at it, the wrinkle across his scrub top from where he'd leaned against the OR table, the stubble that was past the point of being intentional and heading toward neglect, his eyes, which he couldn't read at this distance. He'd been awake for 22 hours. He zipped his bag, put on his coat and went. The drive back to Beacon Hill took 40 minutes because of an accident on Storrow Drive that backed up all the way to the Bowker overpass. He sat in traffic with the radio off, watching the river through the passenger window. The Charles was flat and grey today, the same colour as the sky, the seams between them almost invisible. His phone buzzed on the seat beside him. He looked at the screen. Palmer. Danny. Come on. He set the phone face down. The accident cleared, the traffic moved, the river disappeared behind the trees. He pulled into the parking garage on Myrtle Street, cut the engine, and sat in the dark for exactly 4 minutes before he got out. Catherine Maccabee had a ritual for Tuesday mornings that she had maintained without variation for 31 years. She was up at 6:15. She made her own tea, English breakfast, 1 bag, 2 minutes no more, in a white ceramic pot that had belonged to her mother and that she would not allow anyone else to touch. She drank it at the dining room table in the Louisburg Square townhouse, with the Globe and the Times both open in front of her. The paper versions, because Catherine had decided in 2009 that information consumed from a screen felt less permanent, and she had not revisited that decision since. On this particular Tuesday, the tea went cold. She read the article twice. Then she read the comments on her son's video, which she found without difficulty because Catherine Maccabee was 71 years old and not a fool, and she read those until she felt she had enough information. Then she folded both newspapers, aligned them precisely with the edge of the table, and sat for a long time in the particular silence of a house that is used to its own emptiness. The Louisburg Square house was beautiful in the way that old Boston money is beautiful. Restrained, impeccable, slightly cold. Crown moldings, a grandfather clock in the hall that chimed on the quarter hour, floors that creaked in specific places she knew by heart. Richard had wanted to renovate in 2004, and Catherine had told him with complete finality that renovation was for people who didn't know what they had. He'd let it go. He usually did. She picked up her phone and called her son. It went to voicemail. His voice, recorded years ago, sounding professionally warm. She set the phone down. She refilled her tea. It was cold, she drank it anyway, and looked out the front window at the square. A woman was walking a lab puppy on the far side, the leash tangled around her ankles. A man jogged past in gear that cost more than the monthly rent of most apartments in this city. Louisburg Square in the morning. She knew this view so precisely that she could have drawn it from memory. She thought about what she'd seen in Danny's face on that video. Not the words. The words were what they were and she'd deal with the words, but the expression behind them. The set of the jaw that looked like control, but that she had watched him build piece by piece since he was 8 years old. Since the afternoon he'd broken her Japanese porcelain vase, and she'd come home to find him in his room with the door closed and the pieces swept up and his whole body in that particular configuration of bracing for impact. He'd looked like that on the video. He's terrified, she thought. Not cruel. Terrified. She called her assistant, Isabel. I need a phone number, she said. Julia Sullivan, attorney, Jamaica Plain. It should be findable. Isabel called back 11 minutes later. Catherine dialed. Julia was eating a granola bar over her kitchen sink on Wednesday evening. She'd had it in her bag for 3 days, the wrapper slightly damp, the granola the kind of texture that made her wonder why she'd bought it, when her phone rang with an unknown Boston number. She almost let it go. She'd been letting a lot of things go this week. The granola, the pile of mail on the counter, the text from Stephanie that she'd read at 2 in the morning and started composing an answer to, and then abandoned. The voice in her head that kept wanting to reread Danny's texts from August, the ones from the week after she'd told him, when he'd called every morning and said the right things and she'd started believing them. She answered. My name is Catherine Maccabee, the voice said. Julia put the granola bar down. The voice was unhurried, slightly formal in the manner of people who were raised in rooms where formality was the baseline, but underneath the formality there was something else, something direct, almost urgent, that didn't match the surface. I watched the video, Catherine said. I've read what's being written, and I'm calling to ask for a DNA test. Julia stood very still. The kitchen faucet was dripping. 3 drops, a pause, 2 drops, the irregular rhythm she'd been ignoring for a month. Margot, her orange tabby, was sitting on the windowsill watching her with that specific feline expression that communicated absolutely nothing. "Why?" Julia asked. "Because my son is the father of your child. Your son said otherwise. Publicly." A pause. "My son is frightened. Frightened people do terrible things." Another pause. Shorter. "I've watched him do this his entire life. He breaks things when he panics. He's been breaking things since he was 8 years old." Catherine's voice didn't waver, but something underneath it did, barely. "I cannot fix what he said, but I can ask for this test, and if it confirms what I believe, and I believe it will, then your son will have a documented father, and Danny will have to face what he's done." Julia turned and looked out the kitchen window at the Figuera. It was dark outside now, the streetlight catching the leaves in a way that made them look pewter. "You're going against your own son," Julia said. "I'm going in favor of my grandson." A beat. "If he is my grandson, which I believe he is." The drip from the faucet. 3 drops. Pause. 2 drops. "I'll think about it," Julia said. "That's all I'm asking," said Catherine. She called Marcus Webb the next morning. He was a family law attorney in Cambridge, brick-faced office on Brattle Street, known for being precise and difficult to rattle. Denise had worked with him twice and described him as the kind of lawyer you want when things are actually serious. Things were actually serious. "I've been following the situation," Marcus said, which Julia found simultaneously comforting and irritating. "Before we discuss the test, I want you to know your position. Whatever the outcome, you have legal standing in Massachusetts to—" "I know my legal standing," Julia said. "I'm a lawyer." "Right." A pause. "Then let's talk about the test." The test would be a non-invasive prenatal paternity test, a blood draw from Julia, a swab from Danny if he agreed, or a saliva sample they could compel through the court if necessary. Results in approximately 10 days. Admissible. Definitive. "He hasn't agreed," Julia said. "He doesn't have to," said Marcus. "We can make this happen either way, but if his mother is willing to cooperate—" "She is." Another pause. "That's unusual." "Yes," Julia said. "It is." She scheduled the blood draw for Friday at a lab in Kenmore Square, a place that handled prenatal testing, with the discretion of a clinic that had been doing this long enough to know that discretion mattered. The lab was on the 4th floor of a building above a subway and a phone repair shop. The elevator was slow and smelled like floor cleaner, and she sat in the waiting room looking at a poster about folic acid and thought about the fact that 11 days from now there would be a number, a percentage, something official and permanent that would exist regardless of what Danny Maccabee told a camera outside a restaurant. She found, sitting in that waiting room with its fluorescent hum and its folic acid poster, that she wasn't afraid of the number. She was afraid of what came after it. Danny learned what his mother had done on a Thursday, 3 days into the wait. Catherine called him at 8 in the morning. He was already at the clinic, first consult at 8:30, and told him, not apologetically, not with preamble, just the facts, in the order they'd occurred, in the voice she used for things that were not subject to negotiation. He listened without interrupting, which wasn't control this time. It was more that he ran out of things to say before he found any of them. "You had no right," he said when she was done. "I had every right," Catherine said. "She's carrying what may be my grandchild. If he is, he deserves to know where he comes from. And so do you. This isn't—" He stopped, rubbed a hand over the back of his neck. The prep nurse, Joanna, was passing in the corridor outside his office and glanced through the glass. His face was doing something he couldn't control. He turned toward the window. "This isn't what I need right now." "What you need," Catherine said, "is to stop pretending this is a problem that's going to disappear." A pause, and in it he heard something that almost never surfaced in his mother's voice. Exhaustion. Not the tired kind. The kind that comes from watching someone repeat a mistake long enough to know exactly where it ends. "You've been running from things your whole life, Daniel. You ran from Alyssa, and then you ran from every woman who came close after her, and now you're running from a baby." Her voice dropped. "This one can't just go to voicemail." The line was quiet for a moment. "The results come in a week," she said. "You should be ready." She hung up. He stood at the window of his office looking down at the public garden. The trees were bare now, November having stripped them efficiently, the way November in Boston always did, quickly, without ceremony, as if autumn were a problem that needed solving. A man on a bench below was reading a newspaper and eating something wrapped in a white bag. A woman walked past pushing a stroller. Danny watched the stroller until it was out of sight. Palmer came by the clinic at lunch. "You look terrible," Palmer said, dropping into the chair across from Danny's desk. "I didn't sleep." "How long?" "I don't know. Since Thursday, maybe." Palmer looked at him the way people look at something they recognize but aren't sure how to name. Younger by 4 years, he'd always had an ease that Danny associated with being the second child, the one who got to watch the first one make the mistakes before inheriting the situation. He wore it lightly. He wasn't careless. He just held things at a different angle. "You knew," Palmer said. Not a question. Danny said nothing. "About the baby. You knew and then you did that." Palmer leaned forward. "I'm not here to make you feel worse. I'm here because I'm your brother and because Mom called me and she was—" He stopped. "She was sad, Danny. Not angry. Sad. And that's different." "I know it's different. What are you gonna do?" "I don't know yet. You gotta know. Because when the results come back, you're gonna be standing somewhere, and wherever you're standing, you'll be making a decision, whether you know it or not." Danny looked at the desk. There was a coffee ring on the corner that had been there for 2 weeks, and that he kept meaning to wipe up. He looked at it for a long time. "I was scared," he said. It came out quieter than he intended. Of what? The coffee ring, the bare trees in the garden, the stroller that had long since disappeared. "I don't know exactly," he said. "I'm still figuring that out." Palmer didn't say anything for a moment. Then, "You should probably figure it out fast." He left. The clinic went on around Danny, the sound of the front desk, a patient being called from the waiting room, the muffled PA from the hallway. The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle and lit up the dust on the blinds. He picked up his phone, looked at Julia's number, put the phone back down. The results arrived on a Friday. Julia was in her office when Marcus called. She was eating a sandwich she didn't want, turkey on wheat from the deli on Center Street, the bread slightly stale, the mustard too sharp, and looking at a workers' comp case that she'd been avoiding for 4 days because it required a level of concentration she couldn't currently locate. 99.97%, Marcus said. She set the sandwich down. "Okay," she said. "Julia." "I know." She looked at her hands. Her nail polish, a dark burgundy she'd put on 2 weeks ago, was chipping at the edges of her index fingers in the specific way that happened when she picked at it without thinking. She'd been doing that all week. "I know what it means. Legally, practically, I know. It means—" "Marcus." She stopped him, not harshly. "I know. Thank you for calling. I'll be in touch Monday." She hung up. She sat with the sandwich in front of her for another few minutes, not eating it, and thought about Danny, getting the same number, in a different office, in a different part of the city. Thought about what his face might look like reading it. Thought about whether she cared what his face looked like, and discovered, with the specific exhaustion of honesty, that she did. She cared. She hated that she cared. She cared anyway. She put the sandwich in the trash. She hadn't eaten the second half. Her phone buzzed on the desk. An unknown number. She looked at it, let it go to voicemail. She pulled up a new text thread, typed, "Dad, you free to talk?" The reply came back in 40 seconds. "Always for you, Jewel." She pressed call. Outside her office window, a bus went by on Washington Street, hydraulics hissing as it stopped. Somewhere in the building, a door slammed twice. The cardamom smell from downstairs was faint today, but still there. Her father answered on the second ring, and the sound of his voice, the specific gravel of it, the Southie accent that 20 years in Stoughton had softened but never fully erased, was the first thing all week that made her feel like she was standing on solid ground. She held the phone and said nothing for a moment. "Jewel," Jim said. "Yeah," she said. "I'm here. You okay?" Her hands had stopped shaking sometime in the last hour. She realized now that they'd been shaking and she hadn't noticed. "I'm going to be," she said. The bus outside pulled away, the cardamom smell, the crack in the ceiling above the bookshelf that she'd been meaning to have someone look at for 2 years. "Tell me," said Jim. So she did. Catherine delivered the results to Danny in person. She didn't call first. She arrived at the Beacon Hill Clinic at 5:17 on a Friday afternoon with an envelope in her hand and the expression of someone who has made a decision they're not going to unmake regardless of how the next 30 minutes go. She told the receptionist, a young woman named Grace who recognized Catherine from previous visits and who was currently doing her best impression of calm, that she was here to see her son and was not going to wait. She didn't wait. Danny was in his office reviewing post-op notes when she opened the door. He looked up. She was wearing her grey coat and the single strand of pearls, and she had an envelope that she placed on his desk with the precise deliberateness of someone putting down the last card in a hand they know they're going to win. "Read it," she said. He looked at the envelope, looked at her. "Mom, read it." He picked it up. The paper inside was white and clean and absolutely neutral in the way of clinical documents. No drama in the formatting, no weight placed on any word more than another. It was a page of information, dates, reference numbers. One critical line that he found without searching for it, because his eyes went there automatically, the way eyes go to the one lit window in a dark building. Probability of paternity, 99.97%. He read it twice. Then he set it down on the desk and looked at the corner of the room, the corner behind his mother, above the bookshelf where his medical school diploma hung next to a photo from a reconstructive mission trip to Guatemala in 2019. He'd looked at that corner when he'd gotten the news about his father's first heart scare 5 years ago. He'd looked at it when he'd lost a pediatric patient. He didn't know when it had become the place his eyes went, when the world reorganized itself without his permission. "All right," he said. Catherine sat down across from him. She didn't say anything for a moment. The clock on his desk, a simple thing, analog, a gift from Palmer, ticked with the unhurried indifference of objects that don't care what's happening to the people near them. "You need to go see her," Catherine said. "I know. Not tomorrow. Tonight." He looked at her. In the late afternoon light of his office, with the day having taken what it had taken, she looked older than he usually let himself notice. The lines at the corners of her eyes, the slight loosening at the jaw. She was 71 years old, and she had walked into this office and done a difficult thing, and she was sitting across from him in the aftermath of it and not letting him look away. "What do I say?" he asked. It was the most honest question he'd asked anyone in a very long time. Maybe years. Maybe since he was 8 and had broken the vase and stood in front of her in the kitchen and waited to learn what happened to people who did damage they couldn't undo. Catherine was quiet for a moment. "The truth," she said, "which is that you were afraid. Not excuse it, tell it. There's a difference." He nodded slowly. "She's not going to open the door," Catherine said. "Not tonight. Maybe not for a while. But you need to be there." He picked up the results, folded them back into the envelope. "Why did you do this?" he asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. Catherine looked at him. "Because you were going to run," she said. "And I am tired of watching you run, Daniel. I have been tired of it since you were 23 years old. The clock, the diploma, the photo from Guatemala, where he was standing next to a 12-year-old girl named Lucia, who had been born with a bilateral cleft, and who was looking at the camera with the specific expression of someone seeing something for the first time." "Okay," he said. He put on his coat and went. Jamaica Plain on a Friday night in November. The Green Street T-stop was a block from Julia's building, and the foot traffic was the mix that this neighborhood always was. College kids heading somewhere, families coming back from errands, a guy on a folding bike carrying what appeared to be a very large fern. The houses on her block were the old 2 and 3 family style, the ones with the porch stairs that each building's generation of tenants had repaired in slightly different colors. Christmas lights had gone up on the house across the street. Too early, but it happened earlier every year, and Danny was too far gone in his own head to generate an opinion about it. He rang her buzzer at 8:43. The intercom crackled. He heard her breathing before she said anything. Just a moment of it. The quality of the silence that told him she'd been awake and not surprised by the sound. "It's me," he said. A pause. "I know who it is." Her voice was different on the intercom. Flatter, slightly, but there was something underneath the flatness that he'd learned to read over the months they were together, the place where she wasn't quite as far away as she was presenting. "Julia, not tonight, Danny. I know I don't deserve—" "Not tonight." The intercom clicked off. He stood on the porch steps. The air was cold now, real November cold, the kind with teeth. A cab went past. Someone's window 2 floors up had music playing, something slow and familiar he couldn't place. He looked up at the second-floor windows, the ones he knew were hers. The light was on. He stood there. He wasn't sure how long. Long enough for the cold to get into his collar and his hands. Long enough for the cab sounds to cycle through twice and the music from upstairs to change. He was aware, standing on those steps, of every single thing he'd done in the last 8 weeks. The decision in the cab, the controlled jaw outside Toro, the letter from Prescott's office that he'd approved without reading closely, because approving it meant not having to think about it. All of it. He didn't knock again. He walked back to his car. Inside, Julia stood with her back against the hallway door. The intercom panel was cold against her shoulder. Margot appeared from somewhere and wound around her ankles in the figure-8 motion she did when she sensed disturbance, which was either feline empathy or the fact that it was 40 minutes past her dinner time, and Julia had never been able to determine which. She put a hand on her stomach. 24 weeks now. The midwife had said the baby's kick reflex was developing. She'd felt it twice this week, this low, deliberate pressure that was nothing like the flutters she'd been told to expect, and everything like being poked from the inside by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He's going to be like that, she thought. Precise. She slid down the door until she was sitting on the floor of her hallway, back against the wood, knees at a difficult angle, because 24 weeks made a lot of things a difficult angle. Margot climbed into what remained of her lap and started kneading. Her sweater was the grey one she'd been wearing since Tuesday. She knew it. Didn't care enough yet to change it. She thought about Danny standing on those stairs in the cold. She thought about the fact that he'd come. She thought about the fact that coming was not the same as staying, that showing up was not the same as being present, that she had spent 6 years of her professional life fighting for people who'd been left with very good explanations and no actual support, and she knew the difference between gesture and commitment. She also thought about the look in his eyes in the Gardner Museum, that first night, when he'd turned from the painting and looked at her and said, "Does it seem like a farewell to you too?" And the way something in her had answered yes, not because she'd been looking at the painting, but because she'd been looking at him. She had loved him. She was honest enough with herself to say that now, sitting on the hallway floor with her cat on her lap and her hands not quite steady. She had loved him in the specific dangerous way that you love someone when you've spent years being careful not to love anyone too much, the way that makes the fall exactly as far as you always knew it would be. He's going to be like that. She put both hands flat on her stomach. "And you're going to be fine. We're both going to be fine," Margot purred. The radiator knocked twice, clunk, clunk, and went quiet. The days that followed built on each other the way bad weeks do, each one slightly harder than the one before, the weight accumulating not in dramatic moments, but in small, grinding ones. A client cancelled a consultation Monday morning, citing something vague about the current situation. Julia fired off a response so professionally contained that Dawn printed it out and put it on the break room bulletin board without comment. The thing on the bulletin board made them both feel slightly better. A Boston magazine ran a piece, the kind of piece that pretended to be analysis but was actually just the careful aggregation of other people's cruelty, with a photo of Julia taken at a public fundraiser in 2022, before she'd known Danny, in which she was laughing at something and which they'd managed to crop so that it looked like she was laughing at nothing. The photo bothered her more than the words. She caught herself at 2 a.m. on a Wednesday reading old texts. Not even the good ones particularly, the ordinary Tuesday ones, the ones about whether she'd eaten, the ones where he'd sent her a photo of a particularly bad parking job on Tremont Street with no caption because he knew she'd find it funny. She read them until her eyes hurt, and then she put the phone face down on the bedside table and lay in the dark with the radiator doing its thing and Margot asleep at the bottom of the bed. Pathetic, she thought. She picked the phone back up and kept reading anyway. Jim arrived on a Wednesday unannounced. Well, not entirely unannounced. He'd sent a text at 6 in the morning saying coming in today. I made soup, which was his version of asking. He drove down from Stoughton in his F-150, which had 211,000 miles on it, and which he refused to replace because, he said, she starts every morning, doesn't she? He arrived at 11 with 2 sealed Tupperware containers of potato soup and a loaf of bread he'd made himself on Tuesday, and which was slightly too dense and absolutely perfect. They ate in the kitchen. The radiator knocked. The soup was too hot, and they ate it anyway. "You're not sleeping," Jim said. It wasn't a question. "I sleep," Julia said. "Some. You've got the look your mother used to get." He didn't look at her when he said it, kept his eyes on his soup. When she was carrying everything and trying not to let on she was carrying everything. Julia looked at her father. He was 63, and looked it. The hands of a man who'd worked with them his whole life, the lines at the corners of his eyes from 40 years of squinting against sun and driving and weather. His hair had gone fully grey in the last 5 years, and he still kept it cut close the way he always had. "I'm okay, Dad. I know you are." He broke a piece of bread and set it on the edge of her bowl. "Doesn't mean you have to carry it alone." She looked at the bread, the steam rising off the soup. "I don't know what's going to happen," she said. "After Ben. I don't know how this—" She stopped, tried again. "I don't know how to plan for something when I don't know what shape it's going to be." Jim was quiet for a moment. Then, "You plan for the part you can control. The baby, the work, this apartment." He looked around, at the figuera, the crack in the ceiling, the cat asleep on the chair in the corner. And then you leave room for the rest of it to figure itself out. That's not a plan. No, he said. It's better than a plan. It's trust. She picked up the bread. It was a little too dense and absolutely perfect. Outside, the November sky pressed grey and flat against the kitchen window, and the figuera stood bare in its pot, and the soup was warm, and for a while that was enough. Danny started therapy on a Monday in late November. He told nobody except Palmer, and he told Palmer only because Palmer found the appointment on the shared calendar they'd kept since medical school, for reasons neither of them remembered anymore, and called immediately. "Rebecca Cho," Palmer said. "Your recommendation, she's in Cambridge. I know who she is." A pause. "Good. Don't make it a thing." "I'm not making it a thing. I'm saying good." A pause. "Good," Danny said. "Doctor." Rebecca Cho had an office on Brattle Street in Cambridge, which was in the same building as a violin repair shop and a tax attorney, and which always smelled slightly of rosin from the floor below. The waiting room had 2 chairs, a plant that was somehow thriving, and a painting of a marsh that Danny stared at for the entire 12 minutes he waited before the first session. He spent the first 20 minutes of that session talking about the clinic, about the orbital reconstruction case, about the expansion plans, about the pediatric cleft program he was developing in partnership with a hospital in Providence. He said all of it with the fluency of someone who had described these things many times to many people. Dr. Cho let him talk. When he finished, she said, "And how are you?" He blinked. I told you. The clinic. You told me about the clinic," she said. She had reading glasses pushed up on her head and a notepad on her knee that she hadn't written anything on. "I asked about you." A silence. "I don't know," he said. "Okay," she said. "That's a good place to start." He went back the following Monday, and the Monday after that. It was not comfortable in the way that nothing useful is comfortable when you've spent 15 years actively avoiding it, but it was something, an anchor, a room where the question was always you, not the clinic. He'd forgotten, or perhaps never fully known, how rarely anyone asked that. In those sessions, slowly, the way sediment shifts, not dramatically, just one grain at a time until suddenly the landscape is different, he began to understand what Palmer had said. "You know what the fear is, you just don't want to name it." The name was Alyssa. The name was 23 years old, standing in a dorm room holding a phone, reading a message that said the person he loved had decided he wasn't worth the risk. The name was the drawer the phone went into. The name was the 20 hours of surgery that came after, and the 20 hours after that, and the years and years of being very good at this and very controlled and not available in the ways that would make you real enough to lose. He had loved Julia. He was honest enough to say it to Dr. Cho in their 4th session, in the flat grey light of a Cambridge December, with the rosin smell coming up through the floor and his hands slightly damp. He had loved her, and he had seen the baby coming, and he had done the thing his system did when love became real enough to threaten something. He had dismantled it before it could be taken from him. "You took it from yourself," Dr. Cho said. "Yeah," he said. "I know." He put his phone away after sessions now. Instead of checking it immediately in the elevator, he ordered dinner instead of working through it. He called Palmer back on the same day, usually. Small things, but the small things, he was learning, were the whole point. His phone buzzed one evening in December with a text from an unfamiliar number that turned out to be Palmer. "She had the blood draw at Kenmore last month, BTW. Results are back. You should know." He knew what the results said. He'd gotten his own copy on a Friday from Marcus Webb's office, CC'd by the lab. He sat on his couch, which had a throw pillow out of position that he'd been meaning to fix for a week, and looked at the name on his phone. He'd been ready to go to her for 2 weeks. He just hadn't found the version of ready that was honest enough to deserve the door opening. He was getting there. He wasn't there yet. The throw pillow sat crooked. The December night pressed against the windows. Somewhere on the street below, a car alarm went off and then stopped, and the city went on with its business in its uncaring, total way. His hands were steady. That, at least, was something. Palmer delivered the letter on a Thursday. Not because Danny asked him to. Danny had asked nothing. He'd written the letter on a Sunday evening at his kitchen table with a legal pad and a pen that ran out of ink halfway through the second draft, and that he'd replaced with a different pen that had slightly different ink, which was visible if you looked at the page, and which he'd decided to leave because fixing it felt like caring more about the appearance of the thing than the thing itself. He'd written 4 drafts. Not because the words didn't come. They came, actually, with the specific clarity of something that had been sitting inside a pressurized space for a long time. but because each draft contained something he had to take back. The third draft had an explanation that was really still a justification. The fourth draft had a promise he couldn't keep yet. The fifth, which he'd written Tuesday morning at the clinic before his first patient, had neither. It was 2 pages. The handwriting was uneven in the places where he'd pressed too hard and loose, in the places where he hadn't been thinking about the pen at all, which was most of it. He gave it to Palmer in a plain envelope with Julia written on the outside in the handwriting he'd had since college, which was the only thing on it because he hadn't been able to decide what last name to write. "Don't give her any context," Danny said. "What if she asks? Tell her it's from me, and then leave." Palmer looked at the envelope. "Danny?" "I know." He picked up his coffee. "Just give it to her." Palmer showed up at Julia's office on a Thursday afternoon, unannounced, carrying a coffee from the Dunkin' on Center Street that was for him and not for her, which she found inexplicably less threatening than if he'd brought one for her too. He was taller than Danny by an inch, broader through the shoulders with an easier quality to him, the kind of person who knew how to enter a room without changing its temperature. Dawn buzzed her. "Palmer Maccabee is in the lobby. He says you don't know him." "I know who he is." A pause. "Should I send him up?" She looked at the workers' comp case on her desk, which she had finally gotten through. She looked at her coffee, which was genuinely cold this time, not just neglected cold. She looked at the envelope of Thanksgiving photos her father had mailed her last week, actual physical prints, Jim Sullivan being Jim Sullivan, that she'd propped against the desk lamp. "Send him up." Palmer sat down across from her and placed the envelope on the desk between them without preamble. On the outside, her name, Danny's handwriting. She recognized it immediately and hated that she recognized it immediately. "He said to give it to you and leave," Palmer said. "That's probably wise." "Probably." He didn't move. "He's in therapy for what it's worth." "I didn't ask." "I know. I'm telling you anyway because I think you should know." He picked up his Dunkin' coffee. "He's been going every week since November. Dr. Cho in Cambridge. She's good." Julia looked at the envelope. "Palmer, I'm not here to lobby you," he said. "I'm not here to tell you what to do or to try to explain what he did or to make a case for anything. I'm his brother, so I have opinions, but I'm also a grown adult who knows the difference between what I want and what I get to say out loud." He paused. I wanted to see you. That's really it. I wanted to come and sit here for a minute and see that you were okay." She looked at him. "Are you okay?" he asked. She considered the question with the seriousness it seemed to deserve. The workers' comp case, the cardamom smell, the Thanksgiving photos, the crack in the ceiling that she'd finally gotten the landlord to agree to look at, which was a minor victory in a month of very small victories. "Getting there," she said. He nodded. "Good." He stood up. "Read it when you want to, or don't." He picked up his coffee, which was mostly empty now. "Take care of yourself, Julia." He left. The office went quiet in the particular way it always did after someone left who'd had some weight to them, a lingering sense of the space they'd occupied. Dawn appeared in the doorway after a moment, looked at the envelope, looked at Julia, and retreated without a word. That was one of Dawn's gifts. Julia left the envelope on the desk for 4 hours. She finished the workers' comp case. She returned 2 emails she'd been avoiding. She ate the second half of the granola bar she'd started yesterday, which was stale enough that it barely qualified as food. At 6:15, the building was empty. The bakery downstairs had closed. The dry cleaner's lights were off. The street outside was doing what Boston streets did at 6:15 in December, filling up with people heading home, scarves up, heads down, the specific, purposeful hurry of a city that had decided winter was going to happen whether you liked it or not. She picked up the envelope. The letter inside was 2 pages, handwritten, the ink changing color partway through from a dark blue to something slightly greener, which she noticed immediately, and which for some reason made her throat tighten before she'd read a single word. She read it. She read it again. There were no excuses in it. There were explanations, honest ones, the kind that named the wound instead of dressing it, about what had happened to him at 23, about the drawer the phone went into, about the 15 years of architecture he'd built, in the space where something softer should have been. There was an accounting of what he'd done, and an absence of the word, but that she was looking for and didn't find. The last paragraph was short. "I'm not asking you to respond. I'm not asking for anything. I just needed you to know that I understand what I did. Not what I said I didn't have. I understand what I had and what I did to it. And I'm sorry. Not the kind of sorry that means I want you to fix it for me. The real kind." She folded the letter. Put it in the inside pocket of her coat where the lining had a small tear she kept meaning to sew. Didn't. She turned off the office lights and went home. She did not respond that night. Or the next day or the day after that. She thought about it. She thought about it at 2 in the morning when Ben kicked and she put her hand on her stomach and the night was very quiet. She thought about it over coffee. Real coffee now. The French press she'd allowed herself because she was down to decaf anyway, and the ritual of making it was worth something. She didn't respond yet, because responding before she was ready would be doing the thing she'd always done, answering to fill the silence, accepting less than was real, because the alternative was harder. She wasn't going to do that this time, not with this. But she took the letter out and read it twice more over the following week. She kept it in her coat pocket like something she wasn't sure what to do with yet, but wasn't ready to put down. Ben arrived on a Tuesday morning in February at 6:42, 7 pounds 4 ounces. The delivery team at Brigham and Women's had been, she'd never find the right word for it, present in a way she hadn't known to ask for. A midwife named Claudia, who had been doing this for 20 years, and who had a way of being in the room that was neither crowding nor absent. The nurse who'd held her hand during the last hour was named Marcus, different Marcus from her lawyer, and who had an ex-wife who'd done this twice and whose hands were absolutely rock-steady. Jim was in the waiting room. He'd driven down from Stoughton the night before. She'd called him at 11 p.m. when she'd been timing contractions in the bath, and not yet sure enough to panic, but sure enough to want him close. He'd said, "I'm already in the car," before she finished the sentence. Ben came out screaming, which Claudia said was a very good sign and which Julia heard as the most real sound she'd ever been in the presence of, raw and undeniable and completely without any performance. He was placed on her chest, and she looked at him, and he looked at nothing in particular, and she said hi very quietly, like she was saying it to someone she already knew. Catherine was in the hallway. Julia found this out from the nurse, who mentioned it with careful neutrality. "There's a woman outside who gave her name as Catherine Maccabee. She says she understands if you'd rather she not come in." Julia had been holding Ben for 2 hours by then. She'd slept for maybe 30 minutes. Her hair was an absolute disaster, and she had a hospital bracelet cutting slightly into her wrist, and she had been through something that rearranged the furniture of her interior entirely, and she was not sure yet what any of it looked like now. She thought about what Catherine had done in November, the phone call, the direct, unhurried voice. "I'm going in favor of my grandson." 5 minutes, Julia said. Catherine came in quietly. She was in her grey coat, the pearls. She stopped at the doorway for a moment when she saw Ben, and something happened in her face, a release like a window opening, that Julia had not expected, and that moved her in ways she couldn't quite account for. Catherine approached the bed carefully, the way people approach things they recognize as fragile and precious. "He's beautiful," she said, softly, like she was aware that the volume was wrong for how large the feeling was. "I know," Julia said. Catherine looked at her. The two of them looked at each other for a moment, two women on opposite sides of a thing that had caused considerable damage, in a room with a new person who was the reason any of it mattered. "Thank you for letting me in," Catherine said. "You did the right thing," Julia said, "when it would have been easier not to. That counts." Catherine nodded. She looked at Ben one more time. She left 5 minutes later without being asked, which was the right thing, and Julia sat with her son and the winter light coming in through the hospital window, and her father's voice from the hallway, doing something it only ever did when Jim Sullivan had been through something big, going quiet in a way that was larger than silence. Danny was not there. He'd known. Palmer had told him Tuesday morning when Julia's labor had started. Julia hadn't asked him to, but Catherine had told Palmer, and Palmer had told Danny, and Danny had spent 4 hours sitting with his phone in his apartment on Beacon Hill, knowing that something was happening across the city that he was not present for. He had made a decision. He was not going to show up because he wanted to. He was going to show up when he had the right to. He texted Julia that evening. "I heard he arrived. I'm glad you're both okay." She read it at midnight, nursing with the TV on mute showing something she wasn't watching. She didn't respond that night. 3 days later, from the apartment in Jamaica Plain, in the late afternoon light with the Figuera casting long shadows across the kitchen floor, she sent him a photo. Ben asleep in the grey blanket Catherine's artisan contact had made. One hand curled under his chin, the specific peacefulness of a sleeping newborn, which is the deepest peace Julia had ever witnessed. "His name is Benjamin James," she wrote. "Ben," he responded 4 minutes later. "Thank you for telling me. Nothing else." Which was right. March came. Jim came every Friday. He brought soup and bread, and once an entire pot of his grandmother's beef stew that had been simmering since the night before. He came with the particular kind of company that doesn't fill every space. He could sit in the kitchen for 2 hours and let the silence do its work, and then say one thing that was the right thing, and then not need it to be acknowledged. He'd put a used baby rocker in the corner of the kitchen on his second visit. For when I'm here, and you need to do something with both hands. Julia had stood in the kitchen looking at it for a long time after he left. Danny came to the park on a Saturday in April. Julia had suggested it. Not warmly, not coolly, but in the direct way she had of stating things that had been decided. I'm going to Jamaica Pond with Ben Saturday afternoon. If you want to come, you can. 2 o'clock. He'd said I'll be there. She'd said okay, nothing else. He arrived at 2:02. She was already on the bench near the boathouse, Ben in the stroller beside her, the pond doing its pewter grey thing that it did in April, when the sun hadn't decided yet if it was committed. He was wearing a jacket she didn't recognize, dark navy, well fitted, and the stubble was back to that precise length that was somewhere between intentional and not. He sat down at the far end of the bench, not crowding. He looked at the stroller. Can I look? He asked. Yeah. He leaned forward. Ben was awake, doing the unfocused blinking of a 2-month-old, aware of light and motion but not yet sorting them into meaning. Danny looked at him for a long time. She watched his face. The thing that happened there, the undoing, the absolute quiet collapse of whatever he'd spent years keeping in place. She let herself see it, because she was honest enough to not look away from things that were real. Hey, Danny said quietly to Ben. Ben blinked. Okay, Danny said, mostly to himself. He sat back. He was quiet for a moment. Then, thank you for this. I'm not doing it for you, Julia said. I want him to know where he comes from. He deserves that. I know. He wasn't arguing. Still, thank you. They sat by the pond for 40 minutes. Ben fell asleep with the unfussy efficiency of the very young. A jogger passed twice. A kid fed the ducks 20 feet away, and then got frightened of the ducks and ran back to his grandmother, in a way that made Danny make a sound that was almost a laugh, the first she'd heard from him in months. When they walked back toward the parking lot, the air was cold and smelled like the pond and something faintly like spring, which in Boston was always more ambition than reality in April. But it was there. Same time next week, she said. Not soft, but not closed. He looked at her. Yeah. She pushed the stroller toward Green Street. He went to his car. Neither of them looked back. May arrived the way Boston Mays do, aggressively, everything blooming at once like the city was making up for months of lost time. The magnolias on Com Ave, the dogwoods in Arnold Arboretum, the particular smell of the tea on a warm day that was not a pleasant smell, but was undeniably alive. Danny appeared at her office on a Tuesday afternoon without calling ahead. He had an envelope, plain white, no law firm logo, his handwriting and nothing else. She sent him in. He stood across from her desk, didn't sit, which she noticed, and put the envelope down the way his mother had put the results on his desk, with intention. Voluntary acknowledgement of paternity, he said, signed and notarized, and a support agreement. I reviewed every line, not my lawyer's version. Mine. I wanted it to be fair. She didn't touch the envelope yet. I'm not trading this for anything, he said. Not more time with Ben, not your goodwill, not a conversation about us. This is just what I owe. Why today? She asked. He thought about it. The sessions with Dr. Cho, the walk by the pond, the letter he'd never heard back from and had decided not to need a response to. Because I spent my whole life waiting for the moment to be perfect before I did hard things, he said, and I figured out that the perfect moment is something I invented, so I could keep not doing them. He looked at her. So I stopped waiting. She looked at him for a moment. Then she picked up the envelope. She opened it, read it, slowly, completely, the way she read everything, her lawyer's eye going through it paragraph by paragraph. He watched her and didn't say anything, which took considerably more than it showed. It's good, she said. I'll have Marcus look at it, but it's good. Okay. He moved toward the door. Danny. He stopped. Thank you for bringing it yourself. He nodded. Their small nod contained the kind you make when the feeling is large and the gesture needs to be small to hold any of it. He left. Downstairs, in the stairwell above the bakery, he stopped at the landing and stood for a moment with his hand on the railing. The knot in his chest, which had been there in various configurations since October, had loosened slightly. Not gone, but different. Like something that had been clenched for a long time, was remembering how to open. He walked out into the May afternoon. The magnolias were everywhere. The text came on a Thursday evening in June. Julia was in the kitchen. Ben was in the bouncer on the counter. the one Jim had suggested, and that vibrated at a frequency that produced sleep in Ben with the reliability of a biological function. His eyes were already closed. The kitchen smelled like the garlic she'd roasted for dinner, which had been good, and the coffee she'd made after and was currently letting go cold while she read case files. Her phone buzzed. "There's lentil soup here Saturday. Ben eats at 5. You could come at 5:30 if you want." She'd sent it before she could think herself out of it. She put the phone down on the counter, face up, and watched it. The reply came in 3 minutes. "I'll be there at 5:25. Can I bring bread?" She looked at that for a moment. The specificity of 5:25, not 5, not 5:30, 5:25, which was a person trying very hard to be precise about the thing they could be precise about. She typed a mug of tea emoji and sent it without analyzing it further. Ben made a small sound in the bouncer, not awake, just rearranging, and then settled. The garlic smell, the cold coffee, the figuera in the window, which had put out new leaves in the last week, the pale green of them catching what was left of the June evening light. She'd bought the figuera 3 years ago at a plant sale in Hyde Square, some community garden fundraiser, intending to sketch it. She'd never sketched it, but it was still here, still growing. She'd figure out the sketch. Her coffee had gone completely cold. She drank it anyway. 5:25. He brought a baguette from Iggy's bakery on Fawcett Street in Cambridge. He'd looked up the best bread in Boston on a Thursday night, cross-referenced it against neighborhoods, factored in parking on a Saturday because parking in Jamaica Plain on a weekend required either strategy or luck, and he preferred strategy. Iggy's came up in 3 separate recommendations, none of which agreed on anything else. He arrived at 5:23, 2 minutes early, and stood on the sidewalk outside Julia's building, long enough for a kid on a bike to ask him if he needed help with something. "No," Danny said. "I'm just being careful." The kid looked at the bread. "Cool baguette. Thanks." He rang the buzzer at 5:25 exactly. The intercom crackled. "You're early," Julia said. "By 1 minute." A pause. "There's no rule against early." The door buzzed open. The apartment was what he'd imagined, but different. Not different in a bad way. Different in the way of things that turn out to be more real than you picture them. The kitchen was small, with good light, and a window where the figuera sat in its pot, which he recognized immediately, because she'd mentioned it so many times and it was exactly the kind of thing she'd have. There was a crack in the ceiling above the bookshelf that ran at a slightly diagonal angle, as if the house itself was making a half-hearted argument. The floors were wood, old, with the specific unevenness of a Jamaica Plain triple-decker built in 1910 and accommodated by every generation since. Ben was in the bouncer on the kitchen counter, eyes wide open, tracking the overhead light with the absolute concentration of someone encountering light for the first time and finding it worth all available attention. Danny put the bread on the counter and stood looking at his son. Ben was 4 months old. He was objectively a baby, which is to say he was not yet doing anything that could be called relating or responding or recognizing. He was existing with the total commitment of the very young, but he had his father's hands, which Danny saw immediately and which produced in him something he hadn't expected. Not pride, exactly. More like being seen by something that couldn't see yet. Something pre-language and pre-judgment and entirely without agenda. Julia was stirring something on the stove. She'd glanced at him when he came in. Not a long look, a quick assessment, the kind she made without deciding to, and then gone back to the pot. "The bread's from Iggy's," he said. "I know Iggy's." "I figured you would." She was wearing jeans and a dark green sweater he hadn't seen before, and her hair was up in the specific kind of up that isn't styled, just managed. She was barefoot, which meant the floor was warm, which told him the heat was working, which was information he processed automatically, and then felt slightly absurd about processing. "You can sit," she said without turning around. He sat at the kitchen table. One chair was slightly wonky, the back of it leaning a degree or two to the left, which he discovered when he settled his weight. He didn't fix it. "How's the clinic?" she asked. "Good. The Providence program started last month. 3 patients. The cleft program?" "Yeah." He was surprised she'd remembered. He stopped, started again. "It's the best thing I'm doing right now. Professionally." She glanced at him over her shoulder. "I remember you talking about it." He looked at the figuera. The new leaves were small and pale, the color of things that have recently decided to exist. "You're growing it." "I'm trying. It dropped all its leaves in January. I thought I'd killed it." "What did you do?" "Watered it less, left it alone for a while." She paused. "Turns out it just needed to not be fussed over." He didn't say anything to that, but something in it landed. They ate at the kitchen table with the TV off, which he'd expected and was glad of. The soup was good, a deep, earthy lentil with rosemary that filled the kitchen with a smell that was warm in the specific way that made the grey outside matter less. The bread was right for it, crusty and slightly chewy, the kind that holds up against something robust. Ben slept through most of dinner in the bouncer with the indifference of someone who had been offered a much better deal somewhere else. They talked about things that were not the main thing: her father's garden in Stoughton, the workers' comp case she'd settled in April, the way Boston had gone directly from winter to summer again with no spring, the way it always did, a municipal tradition at this point. He noticed the Thanksgiving photos propped against the desk lamp in the living room, visible from where he was sitting. Jim, Sullivan and Julia at a table, both laughing, a plastic tablecloth with faded flowers. He looked at it for a moment. "He comes every Friday," Julia said, following his eyeline. "Good. Yeah." She pulled apart a piece of bread. "He put a baby rocker in the corner of the kitchen the second time he came. Just put it there without asking. It's still there. Smart man. He's the best man I know," she said. Simply. Matter of fact. Not as an argument for anything. Danny looked at his soup. The bowl was one of those thick ceramic ones, slightly uneven at the rim, handmade somewhere. He picked it up and held it in both hands for a moment. "I've been thinking about what I want to ask," he said. "With Ben. Going forward." She looked at him. "I'm not going to make demands. I don't think I'm entitled to anything." He set the bowl down. "But I want to be present, consistently, in a way that he can count on." He looked at her. "I know that I'm starting from the wrong place. I know what I did. I'm not asking you to forget it." She held his look for a moment. "What does present mean to you?" she asked. "Not hostile. Genuine. Showing up every week if you'll let me. Not missing things. Being the person who knows which pediatrician he goes to and what his sleep schedule is and whether he likes being held face out or face in." He paused. "Being someone he knows." Julia looked at her soup. The steam had died down and the surface was slightly still. "That's a different question from us," she said. "I know." He didn't hesitate. "I'm not putting them together." She looked at him again. "Okay," she said. "We try it." He nodded. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The radiator, which had been quiet all evening, knocked once, just once, and then went still again. After dinner, he washed the dishes. She hadn't asked him to. She'd gone to pick up Ben, who had decided that sleep was over, and now wanted to weigh in on the evening, and Danny had quietly cleared the table and turned on the tap. The water was hot, and the dish soap smelled like lemon, too strong, the kind that leaves your hands dry. He washed the bowls and the soup pot, and the bread knife and the cutting board with the unhurried competence of someone who was used to being alone in kitchens. Julia came back to the kitchen with Ben against her shoulder, doing the slow sway and pat that she'd apparently already developed into muscle memory. She looked at the clean pot on the drying rack, and then at Danny, who was drying his hands on the dish towel. "You didn't have to," she said. "I know." She looked at him for a moment. Then she held Ben slightly out, not fully, not transferring him, just offering the option. Danny dried his hands thoroughly, set the towel down, held out his arms. She placed Ben against his chest. Ben, confronted with this new development, did what babies do when transferred. Stiffened for a moment, then assessed, then settled. He had the dark hair from Danny's side, Julia's nose, an expression of complete sovereign indifference to other people's feelings that was entirely his own. Danny held him with the careful steadiness of his surgeon's hands and stood in the kitchen that smelled like lentils and dish soap, and Julia stood nearby, not quite looking at them, and looking at them anyway, and outside the Jamaica Plain night did its June thing, warm and alive and full of other people's windows. He stayed until 8:15. At the door, putting on his coat, he said, "Same time next week?" She was leaning against the doorframe with Ben in the crook of her arm. "If you bring bread, Iggy's." "Anywhere is fine, Danny." "It's going to be Iggy's." Something shifted at the corner of her mouth, not quite a smile, but in the neighborhood. She looked away before he could be sure. He went down the stairs. On the sidewalk, he stopped and looked up at the lit window. The Figuera was visible from here, just the shape of it, the pale leaves catching the kitchen light from inside. He walked to his car. He didn't look back because looking back was the old habit, the one that meant he was already measuring the distance. He didn't need the distance anymore. Saturdays became Saturdays, the way things become things, without announcement, without ceremony, by the simple accumulation of one and then another until the thing exists. He came at 5:25. He always brought bread, sometimes Iggy's, once a sourdough from a place in Somerville that turned out to be slightly too sour for the soup, a discovery they discussed with the seriousness of a real disagreement. Ben grew, not dramatically, the way babies grow in movies, incrementally the way real things grow, a little more alert each week, a little more present, until one Saturday in July he looked at Danny, and something in his face changed, some recognition assembling itself from the information he'd been collecting, and Danny sat very still and let it happen. There you are, he thought. Palmer came to one of the Saturdays. He showed up uninvited, his default mode, and Julia opened the door to find him with a six-pack of Harpoon and an expression of absolute innocence. "I heard there was soup," he said. "You heard from who?" Julia said. "The Radiator Gossip Network." She let him in. He held Ben for 40 minutes and talked about his girlfriend, Inez, who worked in maritime law and who he described as terrifyingly competent, which is the best quality in a person. He ate 2 bowls of soup and told a story about Danny at 16 that Danny interrupted 3 times, and that made Julia laugh, actually laugh unguarded, the way she laughed when she wasn't thinking about it, and the sound of it in the kitchen was something that Danny put in a place he intended to keep. Catherine came on a Sunday in August. Julia had invited her, texted her directly Sunday afternoon if you want to meet him properly. Catherine had replied within minutes. "Thank you, I'll bring something." She brought a jar of jam, homemade strawberry, from a farm stand in the Berkshires she apparently visited every August, and she sat across the kitchen table and held Ben with the practiced ease of a woman who had done this twice and who had been waiting to do it again for a long time. She didn't perform the emotion. She just had it. "He has Richard's chin," she said. "He has your eyes," Julia said. "The shape of them." Catherine looked at Ben's face, the particular set of the brow, the way he watched things. Then she looked at Julia. "You're a good mother," she said. "I can see it in how he is." Julia didn't deflect it. She used to deflect compliments, reflex, trained young. She'd been working on not doing that. "Thank you," she said. Jim arrived at 3. He walked into the kitchen, saw Catherine, and introduced himself with the handshake of a man who hadn't shaken a hand in 2 weeks and was giving this one everything. "Jim Sullivan," he said. "Her dad." "Catherine McCabe," she said. "His grandmother." A beat. "Coffee," Jim said. "Please," said Catherine. Danny was not there that Sunday. He'd been invited and had said and then his provident a surgical that needed it. He'd texted Julia at noon an apology that was 1 sentence and a follow-up of the Ben's. She texted, "He's fine, don't worry. Come when you can." He came at 5. The kitchen had Jim and Catherine and the smell of the coffee they'd made together, and the remains of a cake Catherine had apparently produced from somewhere, almond, half-eaten, on the counter in its bakery box. Ben was asleep upstairs. Danny stopped in the kitchen doorway, looked at his mother sitting at the kitchen table with Julia's father, the two of them in the middle of what appeared to be a spirited disagreement about the best route from Boston to the Berkshires. 93 to the Pike to 84, Jim was saying. "The Pike to 84 adds 20 minutes, Catherine said. "You take 2 through Fitchburg. 2 through Fitchburg puts you in construction every single time. Not if you go early enough." Danny looked at Julia, who was standing at the counter watching this with an expression that was trying very hard not to be as amused as it was. "How long has this been going on?" he said quietly. "Since about 3:15, she said. "Who's winning?" "Your mother." A pause. "But Jim knows the back roads." He looked at her, the green sweater again, this time with the sleeves pushed up, the hair down, which she didn't often do, the way she was standing, relaxed, leaning slightly against the counter, Ben's monitor in her back pocket. "I love her," he thought. Not for the first time, but for the first time in a room where saying it wasn't completely out of reach. He didn't say it. Not tonight. He went to wash his hands, and then came back to the kitchen and got involved in the root argument on Jim's side, which turned out to be the wrong side strategically, but the right side for the quality of the next 40 minutes. He said it on a Tuesday in September, not a Saturday, not a planned moment. A Tuesday evening when he'd stopped by because he was in the neighborhood, which was marginally true. He'd been in Brookline, which was adjacent, and because he wanted to see if the ear infection had fully cleared, and because he'd accepted by now, not very good at staying away. Julia opened the door. Ben was on her hip, very much awake, holding onto her sweater with the grip of someone who had recently discovered that things could be held and intended to confirm this discovery with everything in reach. "You're not Saturday," she said. "I know. Is it okay?" She looked at him. "Not long. Come in." They sat in the living room with Ben on the floor between them on a blanket, surrounded by the objects he preferred, a soft yellow giraffe that Jim had brought, a crinkly book with a mirror in it, a ring of plastic keys in different colors. He attended to these with the gravity they deserved. They talked. Ordinary things. The Providence program. Her case, which was going to settle, she thought. The crack in the ceiling, which the landlord had finally sent someone to look at, and which the someone had looked at and confirmed, was not structural, just cosmetic, but had not fixed. At some point the conversation ran down, and they were just sitting there in the September evening quiet, with Ben doing his work on the floor, and the last light coming through the windows at the angle it got in September, that low golden thing that makes Boston look like it was designed by someone who genuinely cared. "I love you," Danny said. She looked at him. "I'm not saying it to move anything," he said. "I'm not saying it because I think it opens a door or changes where we are. I'm saying it because it's true and because I've been carrying it around for 11 months, and I'm tired of carrying things that are true without saying them." The quiet. Ben pulling on the giraffe's neck with focused determination. "I know you have reasons not to trust that," Danny said. "I know I gave you those reasons. I'm not asking you to set them aside." He looked at her. I needed to say it once, that's all." Julia looked at her hands, then at Ben, then back at Danny. "I know," she said. "It wasn't the same as 'I love you too.' They both knew that, but it wasn't dismissal either. It was acknowledgement, the kind that says, 'I heard it. I'm putting it somewhere. I'm not ready to return it yet, but I'm not throwing it away." He nodded. "Okay." Ben held up the giraffe and announced something in the specific language of 7-month-olds, which communicated urgency, but not content. "He does that when he wants someone to look," Julia said. Danny looked at the giraffe. "Very nice," he said with complete seriousness. Ben considered this assessment and apparently found it adequate. A Saturday in October. Late. Jim had gone back to Stoughton. Catherine had called at 7 with a question about Ben's winter clothing that somehow turned into a 40-minute conversation that Julia did not mind. The soup had been good, butternut squash this week, a new one, which required a verdict, and the bread had been from Iggy's, because it was always going to be Iggy's and they had both stopped pretending otherwise. Ben was asleep upstairs. The kitchen was the way it got after a good evening, warm, slightly disordered, the dishes done but the table still with 2 glasses on it, and the breadboard with its crumbs, and the candle she'd lit earlier, burning low in its holder. The radiator was doing its thing. Clunk, clunk, pause, clunk, familiar now, almost comfortable, the way all the imperfect sounds of a place you love become part of the place. Danny was at the table. Julia was at the counter. The October night was doing what October nights do in Boston, pressing close, smelling like wood smoke from someone's chimney, and the last of the leaves, the kind of night that feels like it requires something domestic and warm and real to stand against it. She turned around. He was looking at her. Not the careful look, the managed one, the one that held things at arm's length, the other one, the one she'd seen the first night in The Gardener, standing in front of a painting that looked like a farewell. She walked to the table. She sat down across from him. She put her hands flat on the table, and he put his hands on hers, and they stayed like that for a while with the candle burning down, and the radiator doing its imperfect percussion, and the October night outside, and Ben asleep upstairs, and nothing needing to be said or decided or resolved. Just this, just here. Julia looked at their hands on the table and thought about what trust felt like when you'd spent a long time not being able to afford it. Not like a door opening, nothing so dramatic. More like putting something down that you'd been holding so long you'd forgotten you were holding it. She turned her hand over so her palm was against his. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. The candle burned. The radiator knocked. Outside, somewhere on Green Street, someone laughed at something. The sound of it brief and clean, swallowed by the night. They stayed at the table until the candle went out. A year and a half later, Jamaica Plain, April. The magnolias on the street were doing their brief, immoderate thing. 2 weeks, maybe less. The blossoms that gave everything and then left quickly, because that was their deal. The air in the morning smelled like them and like coffee, and like the bakery downstairs, which had expanded its hours and was now open 6 days a week, and which had introduced a cardamom orange scone that Julia had eaten 4 of since February and had not yet confessed to anyone. Ben was 14 months old. He walked. He'd started on a Tuesday evening in February, when he'd let go of the coffee table in the living room and taken 3 steps toward Danny, who'd been sitting on the floor 4 feet away and who had stayed absolutely still, hands slightly raised, not reaching, waiting, letting Ben choose the distance. Those 3 steps were the most focused Danny had been on anything since his hardest surgical cases, possibly more focused. Ben walked now with the full-body commitment of early toddlers, the whole torso involved, arms out for balance, the absolute certainty that forward was the only direction. He'd walked directly into the kitchen cabinet twice last week, and both times stood back, looked at the cabinet and then walked into it again to confirm his hypothesis. He's going to be a scientist, Jim said. He's going to be a menace, Palmer said, which was not mutually exclusive. The apartment in Jamaica Plain had changed in the way of spaces that are actually lived in. It had accumulated. A second set of keys on the hook by the door, a jacket in the closet that was Danny's, and that had been there long enough that no one had mentioned it. The baby books on the shelf had been joined by a surgical reference text that had appeared after Christmas, and that Julia moved to make room for more of Ben's picture books, and that Danny had moved back, and they'd arrived at an arrangement where it coexisted with Goodnight Moon without comment. The Figuera had leaves, real ones, full and dark green, the way it had looked in a photo Julia had seen at the plant sale the day she'd bought it, the ideal version, the one she'd been trying to reach. It had taken 3 years and a winter where she'd left it alone entirely. She had sketched it in March, charcoal on paper, in the notebook she'd bought at the art supply place on South Street. It had taken 2 hours and come out better than she'd expected, and she'd put it on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a lobster that Jim had brought from a trip to Maine he'd taken with a friend from the plumbing union. The sketch was still there. On Saturdays now, they went to Jamaica Pond, the 3 of them usually. Sometimes Jim, sometimes Palmer, once, remarkably, both Jim and Catherine at the same time, a development that had somehow produced a mutual appreciation that neither of them would have predicted, and both of them seemed to find mildly amusing in retrospect. "Your mother knows more about root vegetables than anyone I've met," Jim told Julia. "Your father has opinions about winter storage that are genuinely interesting," Catherine told Danny. Ben at the pond was transcendent. He'd discovered ducks in November and had not recovered. He understood conceptually that he could not go in the water, but felt this was a policy worth challenging repeatedly from different angles in case the answer had changed. He called the ducks duh. He called them this regardless of species. Pigeons were duh. Squirrels were duh. A Labrador they encountered near the boathouse was, with great conviction, duh. "He's going to be embarrassed by that someday," Danny said. "That's years from now," Julia said. "Let him have the ducks." They sat on the bench near the boathouse, Ben between them on the ground, fully occupied with a stick he'd found and was currently bringing to various adults to be admired. The April light on the pond was the pale gold of early spring, and the trees around the edge were doing their tentative thing. That first week of green that looks like the color is still deciding whether to commit. Julia had her coffee from the place on Green Street that wasn't Starbucks, in the reusable cup she'd had for 2 years, with the handle that had a small crack she kept meaning to replace and hadn't. Danny had nothing. He'd forgotten his, and she'd offered to share and he'd said "I'm good" and then taken the cup when she held it out anyway. "Kinda your cup now," she said. "I gave it back. Twice." He didn't have an argument for this. Ben arrived with his stick and held it up to Danny with the expression of someone presenting conclusive evidence. "Very good stick," Danny said. Ben turned and held it up to Julia. "Great stick," Julia said. He considered these verdicts, turned back toward the ducks, walked 3 steps and sat down abruptly in the grass, as was his right. Julia looked sideways at Danny. He was watching Ben with that expression, the one she'd seen the first time he'd held him in the kitchen, the one she'd watched find its permanent address in his face over the last year and a half. Not pride, not possession. Something quieter and more complete. She put her head on his shoulder. He put his arm around her. They stayed like that while Ben conducted his stick research, while the ducks maintained their dignified indifference, while the spring light moved slowly across the water, the way light moves when nobody's in a hurry. She thought about the Tuesday in September. "I love you." The way she'd received it, held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile when you're not yet sure of its weight, the way she'd tested its weight over the weeks that followed, the Saturdays, the dishes, the bread from Iggy's, the ear infection question, the way he had stayed when she'd half expected him not to, the way she'd said it back in November, in this same park, when Ben was asleep in the stroller and the pond was grey and quiet. She'd said it like a fact, not a gate opening, not a surrender, just an honest accounting of what was true. "I love you too." Then she'd pushed the stroller toward the parking lot, and he'd walked beside her, and they hadn't discussed it, because it didn't require discussing. It required living. The crack in the ceiling had been fixed. The apartment had a new lease. Julia had negotiated it herself, 3 years, reasonable rate, with a clause about the radiator that the landlord had signed with the expression of someone who knew they were going to lose, but had decided to lose professionally. The radiator still knocked. Not as badly, but enough. She had decided somewhere in the last 6 months that she didn't mind it anymore. She thought sometimes about Patricia Sullivan reading novels before bed, even exhausted, about Jim with his soup and his too dense bread, and his questions he never asked out loud, about Catherine on the phone in November, saying I'm going in favor of my grandson, about the Gardner Museum in February, 2 people standing in front of a painting that looked like a farewell that turned out to be something else, about the version of herself who'd stood in this kitchen in October, her hand flat on the counter, watching the notification count climb and not being able to move, and the version of herself now in this kitchen, with a figueira in full leaf and a toddler who thought all birds were called da, and a man doing the dishes without being asked on a Saturday evening while she nursed a cup of tea at the table. The same woman, not the same life. Some things need to be broken before they can be built right, Danny had said once. In therapy, probably first, he had a habit now of things starting in that room and finding their way out into the world. My problem was I thought breaking things was the worst possible outcome. Turns out the worst outcome is not being broken at all. She thought about that sometimes. She put her tea down, called toward the living room. He found the marker drawer. Danny appeared in the doorway. Ben was sitting on the floor behind him with an orange Crayola marker and the specific expression of someone who had been waiting for this opportunity. How did he get the bottom drawer? Julia said. He's been working on it for a week. Danny looked at the marker. Ben looked at Danny. The negotiation lasted approximately 2 seconds before Danny sat down on the floor with him and held out his hand for the marker. Ben put it in his hand, looked up at him. What are we drawing? Danny said. Ben pointed at the floor. On paper, Danny said. Ben pointed at the floor again with greater conviction. Julia watched from the kitchen doorway, the evening light, the orange marker, her son and his father on the floor of the living room, negotiating the question of what constitutes an appropriate canvas. She went back to her tea. She was smiling. She didn't decide to. It was just there. Outside, the April evening carried the magnolia smell through an open window. For once, Julia had remembered to drink her tea before it went cold. The radiator was quiet. Ben's first mark on paper was an orange spiral that went off the edge and onto the hardwood. Danny framed it anyway. Some people look at a story like this and see the falling apart. The video, the letter from the lawyer, the intercom clicking off, the worst of what people do when they're terrified and haven't learned yet how to be terrified without destroying something. But the story was never really about the falling apart. It was about what happens when someone decides that the cost of the wall is finally too high. When a woman who learned at 16 that people leave decides to stay anyway, not naively, not without conditions, not because she forgot what happened, but because she did the honest work of separating what he did from what is possible. When a man dismantles something he built over 15 years, brick by brick, Monday by Monday, in a room in Cambridge that smells like rosin, it was about a grandmother who made one phone call that changed everything. It was about a grandfather who put a rocker in the corner without asking. It was about Ben, who did not know any of this, and who loved the ducks, and who was absolutely certain that orange was the right color for the floor. And you, if something you loved was broken, not by accident but by fear, what would you need to believe before you let it be rebuilt? What would it take for you to open the door,